So Apple Music just dropped their 100 greatest albums of all time list, and obviously it's gotten some discussion. So who better to tap in with their opinion than me? Nah, seriously though, all around I thought it was one of the better top 100 lists I've seen from any of these kind of publications, so I wanted to get a quick video out to discuss it. I wanted to go over the things I agreed with, I disagreed with, and I really disagreed with, as well as going over some of the biggest snubs. No need for a long intro, so let's just get right into it. Starting with the things I agreed with. Honestly, looking at this list, I agreed with a lot more than I thought I would. I think generally the top 10 is pretty harmless. It's really hard to pick the top 10 albums of all time, and I think this was a generally good list. I think the really only miss was Lemonade in the 10 spot. It definitely felt like the odd one out. You could also argue that the Amy Winehouse album was a little high, and that Thriller should have been swapped for Off the Wall, but honestly, generally not too bad. Love that Blonde placement. I'm glad it's been out long enough that Blonde can finally be recognized for what it is, one of the best albums of all time. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on Miseducation's placement at number 1, but I think it was deserved. Are there really that many albums better than it on this list? Honestly, no. It's just a pure stroke of genius and a beautiful mix of genres that is essentially a must listen for anyone, so number 1 sounds about right. Another one in the top 10 that totally nailed the placement was Songs in the Key of Life. I know this is a really popular take among lists like these, but honestly if you've listened to this album front to back, you'd understand. Seriously a milestone in the genre and music in general. It's almost cliche to have it this high, just as cliche as something like Abbey Road, but I think this is almost having like Tim Duncan syndrome and is getting overlooked just because it's very aged and is overrated by some. I would say though that this is the only Stevie Wonder album that should have made the list. I think Inner Visions just doesn't have the same energy that this album does. Rapid Fire, I really like the placement of Aquemini. Right below Illmatic and right above Talking Heads somehow just makes sense. Also huge that Flower Boy is on here. I'm so surprised that it made it over Igor. I really thought it was generally the more celebrated album, but y'all know my feelings on Flower Boy, so just know I was giddy, no Josh, when I saw that. Baduism was a W, Low End Theory low-key should have been higher, and I love the placement of Daft Punk's Discovery. Next, these are the albums that I didn't really disagree with too hard, but more I just thought were a little weird. First, okay, I do think a Travis Scott record could sneak into the top 100, but definitely not Astroworld. In my opinion, it should definitely be Rodeo, but I am still on the fence on whether it was right or not to even include. I do think Astroworld has the more cultural influence over Rodeo, and you can tell there was a lot of consideration into the impact on this entire list. Like, for example, Taylor Swift's 1989. Now, a lot of people don't even think this should have sniffed the list, but honestly, I don't necessarily hate it being on here. I get it, I really do. But 18, Taylor's version, really? I think it could be around the 80s, not quite 18. The inclusion though does make a lot of sense. A huge moment for pop. But the 18th best album of all time, especially the re-released version of it, no. Another example of cultural impact giving the album a bit of a boost, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. Honestly, this album probably should have made the top 100, but it's low-key barely top 5 Kanye. I definitely think at least The College Dropout should have been on here, but higher than Twisted Fantasy for sure. Bob Dylan's Highway 61. I like the placement of Bob Dylan this high, but it shouldn't be this album. Blood on the Tracks is my personal favorite, but I could see either Freewheelin' or Blonde on Blonde in this spot. Dylan tends to be pretty high on these lists, deservedly so, but I think that Highway 61 shouldn't be in the top 100, especially over these other 3 Dylan records. Drake's Take Care is pretty high, definitely another carried by Namesake. As much as I love Drake, he may have a couple songs that rank like top 500, but not a top 100 album. However, I'm not absolutely mad that he's on here, just if he was going to be, maybe put him a little bit lower. Then one that I think we could do an even swap and it would fix it is swap SOS for Control. SOS is a fantastic record, just not as much impact and consistency as Control. SOS solidified SZA's spot at the top of the R&B game, but Control put her there. Control is for sure a classic though. But it being snubbed was honestly surprising, especially when she got a rep, period. and a couple rapid fire. Swap Are You Experienced with Electric Ladyland, push Voodoo up a bit higher, and maybe swap out Dark Side of the Moon with any other of the big Pink Floyd records, and swap out Paul's Boutique with License to Ill. Overall though, there were some weird choices, but nowhere as weird as these next ones. Here's where we get into the seriously baffling picks. First off, Billie Eilish being in the top 30, let alone top 100 albums of all time is crazy. When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go was barely a top 30 album of 2019. Bad Guy is undoubtedly a banger, When the Party's Over and Bury a Friend are all really good too, but generally the rest of the album is in the good, not great category. This was such a weird choice for a top 100 album of all time. Hell, it might not even be the best Billie Eilish project. In a similar vein, Adele's 21 is simply not the 15th best album of all time. For sure, this is one of the more standout records of that decade, and honestly maybe the 21st century so far. I do think we forget just how big this record was. There are like 3 songs out of the 11 on here that were number 1 on the Hot 100, and there honestly isn't a bad song on it. For sure, it's a masterful album in the singer-songwriter genre that I think it's a little bit underrated, but 15th best album ever is insanity. I could maybe see it sneaking into the 90s, but honestly I don't think it should be here. A choice that I think is a bit indicative of a larger problem on this list is Bad Bunny's Un Verano Sin Ti. I'm not even mad at this being on the list if we're looking at it clearly from an impact standpoint, but it does kind of open up a whole nother can of worms. If we're clearly focusing on albums that are big in the West, including Bad Bunny's album almost feels a little icky. Like, oh, we forgot to put any albums from any other country besides America. What do people like other places? Just throw in some Bad Bunny record. Feels a little bit strange and almost like an afterthought. There's so many different records from so many different countries that could have been represented but weren't. And the only world rep that we get is Bad Bunny, an artist generally popular in the West. In that case, just don't include it at all, or open up the list a bit. Again, not even mad that it's here. I think it's a great record. I just think it says more about the list than anything. And I know it's cliche, but Illmatic does really need to be higher. This list feels like it's having an identity crisis, like it's focusing on too many different things at once. Influence, quality, memorability, immediate impact, all throughout every genre makes the list feel like it's spreading itself a little bit too thin. So we end up getting picks like Illmatic at 39, below Billie Eilish, mind you. If we're gonna put Illmatic at 39, at least be consistent. Don't put things like Billie Eilish and Taylor Swift above it. Finally, there simply should not be a single AC/DC album on this list. I feel like one of the people that say we're done with the 90s, but it's simply true. It's time to admit that AC/DC was not good. I get that it had impact, I get that it's full of hits, but top 100 all time it is not. Same with the album that came right after it in Lady Gaga's Fame Monster. Full of hits, made some waves in the genre, didn't age well enough to be a top 100 album of all time though. And while we're on a negative note, let's finish it off with some snubs. Getting the obvious one out of the way, Where on Earth is To Pimp a Butterfly? There were plenty of artists with 2 albums represented on this list, and Kendrick not being one of them is kinda crazy. I do get putting Good Kid Mad City over it, but I don't get not having T-Pab at all. Another hip-hop album that I usually see on these type of lists that I usually agree with is J Dilla's Donuts, a beautiful and heart-wrenching instrumental album that not only acted as a send-off to Dilla, but a send-off to his sound as a whole. I think this was a really weird exclusion, especially with all the other classic hip-hop albums that made it on here. In the same vein, one I usually see on these lists is Mad Villainy. While I don't necessarily think it should be on here myself, I definitely think it was an interesting snub. On the topic of those last 2 albums, I'm gonna go full nerd and say there was a very interesting lack of post-rock and shoegaze classics on here. If we're not gonna put Loveless or Souvlaki on here, at least put an album in a similar yet more widely respected vein like King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King. Speaking of genres that got very little love, how about country? Not a single Johnny Cash album, not a single Willie Nelson record, hell, even John Prine, a more folksy type of country, was completely snubbed. Really the only country rep was Casey Musgraves, which, let's be honest, is not better than any of these artists. Even another genre that was overlooked like jazz still got their biggest hits like Miles Davis, Kinda Blue, so to not even see a classic like Johnny Cash's American Recordings is kinda crazy. I would have loved to see a Sufjan Stevens record, and I feel like that would have been a safe bet based off the vibe on this list, but I guess I was wrong. Same with the record Things Fall Apart by The Roots, another classic that I would have expected to see on here based on how many neo-soul classics are on this list. Some other personal choices would have been like Reasonable Doubt, In Rainbows, maybe an LCD Sound System record, and I would have thrown in Die Lit in there just to give that style of trap a representative. Actually, throw Die Lit in the top 10. Matter of fact, just put it at number 1. I think that's something we can all agree on. Overall though, I don't think Apple completely missed. They got a lot of the classics, they put in some new and unique records that I wouldn't have expected from a list like this, though there were some clear snubs on here and crazy takes. What do you think Apple missed on? What do you think they hit on? And what would you have included personally? Thanks for listening to me rant about random crap again, and if you liked what you saw, leave a like, a comment, a subscribe, whatever you got. Thank you so much for watching.